Imagine being 14 years old. It's the last week of middle school. Summer break is only days away. High school is just around the corner. For most teenagers, that moment feels exciting. New classes, new friends, new opportunities. For Nacole Smith, the future felt wide open. She wanted to become a pediatrician, but first, she had another dream. She wanted to become a majorette, performing during halftime while the band played. But on June 7th, 1995, Nacole left her apartment to walk to school, and she never made it. Somewhere in the woods near her apartment complex, neighbors would later say they heard something chilling, haunting, a young girl screaming, begging for her life. What police didn't know that morning was that the DNA left at the scene would sit in evidence for more than 2 decades before finally revealing the man responsible. But in 1995, investigators had no idea that the answer to the case was already waiting for science to catch up. Nicole lived with her mother, Aquanella, and her siblings at Landrum Arms Apartments in Atlanta, Georgia. The neighborhood wasn't considered the safest, but Aquanella had a belief she repeated often to her children. It's not where you live, it's how you live. She was raising her 3 children as a single mother. She had an older daughter named Nikita and a younger son, and right in the middle was her 14-year-old daughter, Nacole. Nacole had big dreams. Her family said she loved helping younger kids, which is part of why she wanted to become a pediatrician. Teachers described her as respectful and bright. Friends remembered her smile. She was finishing her last week of middle school, preparing to enter high school. Like many teenagers, she was excited about what came next. She wanted to become a majorette and recently tried out for the team and made it. Nacole had her whole entire life ahead of her. The morning of June 7th, 1995 began like any other day for the Smith family. Before Nacole left the apartment, her mother told her something simple. She told her not to put her hair in a ponytail. Just one of those everyday small moments between a mother and a daughter. Before leaving, Nacole told her mother, I love you. Then she and her sister Nikita began walking towards school. The walk normally took about 10 minutes, but at 9:20 a.m., as Aquanella was in her apartment getting ready for her day, she suddenly heard gunshots nearby, and it stopped her in her tracks. Almost immediately after, she developed what she later described as a debilitating headache. Some parents describe moments like that as intuition, as if somewhere deep inside they already knew something terrible happened. For families, there are moments that replay forever. The last thing someone said, the last time you saw someone walk out the door. And while those moments are ordinary in nature, it's sometimes the moments many victims' families never forget. Police responded to a 911 call around the time that Aquanella heard those gunshots. A person reported that someone had been shot and they were lying in the woods. When detectives arrived, they found a disturbing scene: a backpack, clothing scattered across the ground, and the body of a young girl, which was partly clothed. She had been shot in the back of the head, but investigators soon realized she also had been shot in the face, and it was at close range. Detectives also believed she had been sexually assaulted. This wasn't random violence, this was predatory. At the scene, investigators recovered two 9mm shell casings, a projectile, and shoe impressions. The impressions appeared to be from K-Swiss sneakers. And if you are a sneaker fan or you were just aware of pop culture at the time, back in the mid 90s and early 2000s, everybody had a pair of K-Swiss. Inside the red backpack that was on scene, detectives found identification. The victim lived about 50 yards away from the wooded area. Her name was Nacole Smith. Two detectives went to Nacole's apartment, and they found her mother, Aquanella. They asked her for a photograph of Nacole, which she gave freely, but Aquanella already felt something was wrong and off. When police told her Nacole never arrived at school, she knew it was, in fact, her daughter that was murdered in the wooded area she forbidden her children to walk through. She couldn't accept the news. Word spread quickly throughout the apartment complex, and neighbors began sharing with police that they heard something haunting. They heard what they believed was Nacole's screams in the woods, begging for her life. Parents in the complex were terrified. Children walked to school in that neighborhood every day. Now, everyone wondered if it could happen to Nacole, then it could happen to their children as well. Detectives were committed to pinning down the timeline of when Nacole went to school and what occurred that morning. So they interviewed Aquanella and her sister Nikita. That morning, Nacole and Nikita went to their mother and asked if they could walk to school together with their friends. She agreed hesitantly, but she warned them not to take the shortcut through the woods. That shortcut was between two apartment complexes. The trail cut through a wooded area and shaved minutes off their commute to school. But it was isolated, quiet, easy for someone to hide. So she believed that sending them to school together, avoiding the shortcut, would ensure them safety. According to Nikita, she and Nacole traveled to school, and as they were walking, they stopped at the corner store with a friend just to get some snacks. Inside the store, Nacole realized she left her homework at home. And so she told her sister that she wanted to return back to the apartment to get it, and she would meet them later that day. Her sister watched her as she walked over the hill, heading back towards the apartment. Investigators believe that's when she took the shortcut through the woods. Somewhere along that path, she encountered the person who would take her life. And it's hard not to think about, once again, how ordinary that moment must have felt. And we talk a lot on Murder in the Black about these ordinary moments, a morning that started routine, taking a quick shortcut through the woods. Something I'm sure people in the complex did all the time. And so did Nacole, despite her mother's warning. Nothing ever happened when she took the shortcut, so why not take it now? Yet moments like this remind us how something ordinary can turn into something unthinkable. And according to investigators, these ordinary moments, the routines that we follow every day, is what predators prey on. They're hoping to find you doing your normal routine so that your guards can be down. After Nikita was interviewed, she told investigators something that was pertinent towards the case. She said she remembered a man who was in the corner store and he was in line as they checked out. She said that he was light skinned, a black male around his 20s, and he was wearing K-Swiss. A detail detectives did not reveal to the public, but they knew was important to the case. Later that day, a landscaper came forward and he said he heard screams in the woods as well as gunshots and saw a black male who was light skinned wearing khaki pants running down the trail. Now, investigators knew that both of these accounts matched one another, and so they were able to come up with a composite sketch of who they believed the perpetrator was. They passed out flyers to the community, but the search didn't stay only with police. The community rallied around Aquanella and her family, and residents began passing out copies of the composite sketch to the community and throughout the neighborhood, hoping someone would recognize the man. Eventually, people pointed out a man who lived in the same apartment complex who looked similar to the composite sketch. His name was Jamar Hendrix. Now, some members of the community believed Hendrix looked exactly like the sketch, and they confronted them. It was members of the apartment complex along with members of Nicole's family. Now, emotions were obviously running high, and at one point, a physical altercation broke out. So, police had to be called to respond and separate everyone. But detectives on the case could not deny that Jamar looked exactly like the composite sketch, and they know they needed to vet him. They were able to determine that he had an alibi for the day in question. He was not the killer. Moments like this show how complicated investigations can become. When a community is grieving, desperate for answers, suspicion can move quickly. Sometimes someone becomes the focus simply because they resemble a composite sketch, even when the evidence shows they have nothing to do with the crime. And that's why it's important to follow the evidence. And as we dig through this case, you will see several incidents where the police and the community identify someone and it turns out not to be the person they were looking for. And that's why evidence is critical in murder cases, because at first you can have a hunch or tip where it looks like you've got the right person, or this person's background suggests that they're responsible for the crime. However, it's when you compare scientific evidence that you're able to identify or exclude who's responsible and who's not. Now, investigators still had important evidence collected from the crime scene. During the investigation, detectives were able to recover the DNA evidence from the sexual assault that occurred during the time of Nicole's murder. That evidence was sent to the GBI for analysis. They were able to come up with a profile through the DNA evidence provided. That evidence was uploaded to CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, a national database used by law enforcement to compare DNA for crime scenes with DNA from known offenders. Now, investigators hoped the system would produce a match, but it didn't. And when that happens, it usually means one of two things. Either the person responsible has never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require their DNA to be entered into the system, or their DNA simply hasn't been collected yet. So, despite having witness descriptions, a composite sketch, shoe impressions from K Swiss sneakers, ballistic evidence from the 9mm casings, and a DNA profile from the crime scene, detectives still had no confirmed suspect. Despite the setback, Nicole's mother refused to let the case disappear. She continued speaking to the media, continued to advocate for her daughter. And very quickly, the case that seemed as though it would be solved quickly began to slow down and became a cold case. But investigators never completely stopped working on the case. And then another lead appeared in 2002. In August of 2002, investigators received a tip from an inmate at Calhoun State Prison. The inmate claimed that someone in the prison bragged about killing a girl in the woods back in the 90s. He identified the man as Bernard Carr. Now, detectives traveled the long way to Calhoun State Prison to talk to him, and he mentioned that this guy's name was Rhodes after giving the detectives the full story. They were able to interview Rhodes, and Rhodes said that he was involved in a shootout in the woods and the girl got caught up in the crossfire. And they didn't believe him. They thought this was the most they ever received on the case since 1995 when it occurred. And so they needed to have DNA evidence. They connected Rhodes's DNA and compared it to the DNA found in Nicole's rape kit. And it turned out that it wasn't a match. Another lead, another dead end. But investigators didn't know it yet. 9 years later, another young girl would survive an attack that would reopen the entire investigation. On June 20th, 2004, in East Point, a young girl named Betty Brown spent the day with friends. They had gone to a cookout at a nearby park. Later that evening, Betty began walking back towards home alone. Along the way, a man approached her. At first, he began speaking with her casually, asking her why she was out, but she got an eerie feeling about him, and he made her feel uneasy. As they walked, they approached a wooded area, and suddenly the situation turned violent. The man pulled her down into the woods. Betty fought as hard as she could, but the man overpowered her and raped her. Before leaving, he issued a terrifying warning. He told her not to say anything or he would find her and kill her. But Betty made a decision that if she survived this attack, she was going to remember everything she could about her perpetrator. And that description will later become very critical to the investigation. As soon as the man stood up, Betty ran in the direction of her house. And that's when she encountered her mother's friend along the way, who saw her exhausted, crying, and extremely upset. And so she drove Betty to her mother's house. Betty immediately told her mother what happened, and the police were called. Investigators responded and canvassed the area thoroughly, but they were unable to locate the suspect. Doctors did perform a rape kit on Betty, and detectives uploaded the DNA evidence into CODIS. Soon afterward, investigators received a match. Police went to Betty's home to speak with her, and they told her something shocking. The DNA connected to another victim, but that victim had been killed. Her name was Nacole Smith. Betty felt a connection to Nacole, knowing that she would never be able to talk to Nacole about their shared experience, and also realizing that she survived. When investigators looked at these two cases side by side, the similarities were striking. Both girls had been walking alone. The distance between the two crime scenes was only 2.3 miles, and both victims were nearly the same age. Betty, 13, and Nacole, 14. Betty was also able to give investigators a detailed description of her attacker. She described a man in his late 20s to early 30s, brown skin, a gap between his front teeth, round wired frame glasses, a bald head. She remembered everything. Now, all of these details were used to come up with a composite sketch via computer. For detectives who had been working on Nacole's case for years, the sketch gave them new hope. And although they had this match, they still didn't have a perpetrator, but they felt like for the first time since Nacole's case turned into a cold case, the sketch that they had from Betty was the description of also Nacole's killer. So detectives began canvassing Betty's neighborhood, showing the sketch to residents, and eventually the sketch produced a lead. And it was at the area where Betty went for the cookout at the park. A detective was canvassing that area and came upon a man that looked exactly like the composite drawing. His name was Terrence, and Terrence lived close to both locations. He lived close to where Nicole's apartment was, and he also lived close to where Betty was attacked. And they knew one thing about the perpetrator, that he stayed in the neighborhood of the surrounding areas where both young girls were attacked. And Terrence lived in the area. So not only did they have the composite sketch, which was a very good indicator of who the perpetrator was, they also knew that this person stayed in the area and had stayed in the area around the time that Nacole was raped and murdered, and was also staying in the area when Betty was raped. So they felt like they had their person. They approached Terrence and they began to question him. And they said that based on this composite sketch, he was a person of interest. So detectives said, well, listen, two young girls have been raped. One was murdered in 1995. If you're not the person, then surrender your DNA. But for Terrence, it wasn't that simple. He didn't want to give his DNA. So he refused, and without enough evidence, they couldn't arrest him, so police had to release him. But investigators began to surveil him. And one evening, Terrence took out his trash. And so detectives began to surveil him. Now, we know in true crime, you can either willingly give your DNA or police can retrieve your DNA once you throw it out. So when they surveilled him, they were looking for him to throw out his trash, to have a cup that he was drinking out of, that he threw away that belonged to him. And initially, they found him taking out his trash. When they surveyed the trash, they didn't find anything with significant amount of DNA that they could test. But eventually, he came outside and he was smoking a cigarette. And investigators watched closely because they needed to know exactly where he flicked his cigarette butt so that they could go and retrieve it. So as they watched, they identified where he threw it, and detectives quickly moved in and retrieved it. Now, based on everything that I just said to you guys, it seems like this is the person, right? They've got their guy. So they were prepared to upload his DNA into CODIS, and they knew they would have a match. Once that DNA was submitted to the GBI and then compared to DNA profiles that was in Nacole and Betty's case, the results came back. And the news, well, it shocked them. The DNA did not match that found in Betty Brown and Nacole's case. Terrence was not the killer. That happened in 2004. And it was a major blow, not only to the detectives who were trying to bring a resolution to this case for the families and bring the perpetrator to justice. It was a major blow to Betty Brown and Nacole Smith's family. In December of 2005, a billboard just a quarter mile from where Nacole had been killed was placed on display, offering a reward of $10,000 for information. But still, the case remained unsolved and no tips poured in that were substantial. So detectives turned to the media. And I think the media is such a useful tool. That's why what we do here on Murder in the Black is partly, yes, for the lore of true crime, but it's really for the advocacy that goes into telling these true crime stories. Because the media has such a powerful voice, it can give new life to cases. And that's why it's important for detectives and media to work side by side to come together for the common goal of solving the case. So that's exactly what detectives in Nacole Smith and Betty Brown's case did. They turned to the Cold Case Files, which is a popular show on television, to help them feature the case and to hopefully bring more awareness and bring new tips so that the case could be solved. And as detectives were filming their segment about the case and giving new details that they garnered, they received another tip. The tip pointed to a man named Stephen Burris. He had an outstanding warrant and he resembled the composite sketch. And I know if you're anything like me, by this time in the case, you were thinking, my God, if we find out that somebody else resembles this composite sketch, and you just don't have any hope, because at this point in the case, I had no hope either. I'm like, okay, it resembles this man. He has a violent background. All right. But we've been here before in this case. Now, they also had another factor that led them to believe that this might be their guy. He lived close to where both girls had been attacked, and he had been in the area for quite some time. Police had reason to arrest him because he had an outstanding warrant for a probation violation. And detectives bring him in and they conduct an interview and they tell him that he is suspected to be a part of 2 vicious rapes and 1 murder back in 1995. Well, he denies it. And when it comes to him turning over his DNA, he agrees because he adamantly says he has nothing to do with it. And so, yeah, you can have my DNA because I didn't kill anybody. The sample was submitted to the crime lab, but once again. Dun, 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 dun. The results came back and it wasn't a match. Another suspect ruled out and the case remained unsolved. Another detective was assigned to this case and it wasn't a task force that was assembled. But investigators never completely stopped searching for answers. The case remained open. Around that time, a revolutionary technique had began changing criminal investigations: genetic genealogy. Now, a lot of us know about genealogy testing as it relates to cold cases because of the Golden State Killer. And this was actually what detectives were looking at when they decided that they would use this type of technology to see if they could possibly get a match for Nacole Smith's case and Betty Brown's. They went forward with this method. They uploaded the unknown DNA profile into a genealogy database. For years, nothing happened until finally, October 2021, investigators received a lead. The DNA did not match a direct suspect. Instead, it pointed to a family tree, the Arnold family who lived in Southwest Georgia. Detectives began narrowing down possible relatives who lived near the crime scene in 1995. It matched the suspect's age. They also were able to narrow it down because of the composite sketch. Eventually, all those questions led detectives to one name: Kelvin Arnold. Kelvin Arnold had been living in the same area where Nacole was killed and where Betty Brown had been attacked. When investigators compared his appearance to the composite sketch, the resemblance was striking. And it was striking all the other times too, but I guess it was just spot on. Detectives also discovered he had a lengthy criminal history, including felony aggravated assault. Even more disturbing, between Nacole's murder and rape and Betty's rape, his girlfriend accused him of sexual assault. Investigators needed his DNA. They located evidence that was, I believe, a part of another case that had Kelvin's DNA on it and compared it to the DNA profile they had from the crime scenes. And this time, the results were clear. It was a match. Detectives prepared to move in and finally arrest the man who was responsible for Nacole's death and Betty's rape. But there was a devastating problem. Kevin Arnold had died in 2021 at the age of 49 from kidney and liver failure. When detectives delivered the news to Aquanella, Nacole's mother, and to Betty Brown, the survivor who helped connect the case, both women felt cheated out of justice. The man responsible would never stand trial, but after decades of uncertainty, the truth had finally been uncovered. Quick pause just in case you're locked in right now. I want to make sure that you're subscribed to Murder in the Black and you press that bell icon so that you can keep up on our updates. For exclusive episodes and subscriber-only content, consider becoming a paid subscriber. And here's a little nugget. We have a 3-day free trial on Apple Podcasts just in case you want to figure out the lay of the land first before you commit. Storytime with Steph is back. That is where I present many true crime stories you won't always hear on our main feed, but the stories deserve to be told. You can watch that on whatever social media platform you enjoy us on. But I especially want those of you who are on TikTok to know that I'm back, and this is where we started our Murder in the Black community. One more quick favor. Make sure you leave a 5-star rating and review if you enjoy the work here. Let's get back into our story. Now, I want to reflect on some things that stood out to me regarding this case. One of them is how relentless investigators were. They followed leads, promising leads, uncanny resemblance. They investigated suspects, and sometimes those leads led nowhere. Just because someone resembles a sketch doesn't mean, as we have learned, that they committed a crime. Another detail that stands out is how important Betty Brown's survival was. If Betty had not reported what happened, if she had not remembered what her attacker looked like, this case might not have ever been solved. And sometimes justice doesn't come in the courtroom. Sometimes justice is simply the truth coming to light. Before we wrap up today's episode, I want to talk to you about 3 cases. 2 were sent in by listeners. First, shout out to Jalen, who sent us a story out of Cleveland, and another big shout out to Jeanette. If you ever come across a case you think we should talk about here in True Crime and Current News, feel free to send it in. Now, the first case we'll start with is the one Jalen sent in. 2 young girls were found inside suitcases buried in shallow graves near a Cleveland school. They were later identified as 10-year-old Amore Wilson and 8-year-old Mila Chapman. Authorities say the girls' mother, Aaliyah Henderson, has been charged with 2 counts of aggravated murder and child endangerment. Investigators say the bodies were discovered after someone noticed suspicious bags in a wooded area near the school. At this point, investigators are still working to determine exactly how the girls died and how long their bodies have been hidden. The case has shaken the community and remains an active investigation, with prosecutors continuing to gather evidence. Now, the next case comes out of the Bronx and is especially dear to Jeanette, as this is her aunt and cousin. Back in 2005, police responded to an apartment in the Popham Avenue after reports of a shooting. When officers arrived, they found 47-year-old Gessel Cowan and her 31-year-old son, Garrett Cowan, both fatally shot inside the home. Investigators identified the suspect as Anthony Sanders, Cowan's boyfriend. According to police, Sanders called 911 himself after the shooting, reporting what had happened. But by the time officers arrived, both victims had already died. Prosecutors later said the violence stemmed from a domestic dispute, turning a personal conflict into a deadly tragedy that also claimed the life of Cowan's son. Saunders was eventually charged with 2 counts of murder and weapon offenses. Rather than going through a full trial, Saunders ultimately pled guilty and received a lengthy prison sentence under New York's murder laws, a sentence that will keep him incarcerated for decades. And finally, a case currently making headlines out of Tennessee. And you guys have to tell me what you think about this case, because we are now starting to see a emergence of AI taking over our lives to some degree, whether we're going there to talk to ChatGPT or another AI system instead of Google, or we're now using it in our everyday lives, whether at work or through other means. And so this case is especially interesting to me as we see an emergence of AI. I think we will start to see more cases that look similar to this. Former NFL linebacker Darren Lee is facing first-degree murder charges in the death of his girlfriend, 29-year-old Gabrielle Perpetuo, in Tennessee, near Chattanooga. Authorities say deputies responded to Lee's home after reports of an unresponsive woman and discovered Perpetuo dead inside the residence. Lee reportedly told investigators he found her unresponsive and believes she may have fallen in the shower. But prosecutors say the evidence inside the home suggested something very different. Investigators reported finding blood evidence in multiple areas of the house, broken glass, and injuries on Lee that they say were consistent with a physical struggle. What makes this case especially unusual is what investigators say they found on Lee's phone. Prosecutors claim Lee had multiple conversations with ChatGPT in the hours and days after the incident, allegedly asking questions about how to explain the situation and what he should tell authorities. Investigators say those conversations could help establish a timeline of events and possible attempts to shape a narrative before contacting police. Lee is currently being held without bond as the case moves through the court system. Cases like these remind us just how complex the search for truth can be. Sometimes it's domestic violence escalating into devastating loss, as we saw in the Bronx. Other times it's an ongoing investigation still trying to uncover what happened, like the heartbreaking case of Amora Wilson and Mila Chapman in Cleveland. And now we're seeing how digital footprints, even conversations with AI, may become a part of criminal investigations, adding a new layer to how cases are built and prosecuted. As always, here on Murder in the Black, we'll continue to follow these cases closely. Some cases reach a legal conclusion, like the tragedy in the Bronx. Others, like the Cleveland case and the Tennessee investigation, are still unfolding. And when new information comes out, we'll bring those updates back to you here on True Crime and Current News. Because these stories don't end when the headlines fade, and the search for answers doesn't stop until justice runs its course. If you enjoy the kind of storytelling you hear on Murder in the Black, be sure to join our family. You can do that over on YouTube by subscribing and smashing the bell icon so you're notified every time we post a new video or podcast episode. And if you want to go even deeper into these cases, join us on Substack. In Season 9, every podcast episode is paired with a Substack article where we dive further into the details and conversations surrounding the case. Full episodes of Murder in the Black drop every Thursday. And on Wednesdays, I share a story time with Steph, where we do a shorter deep dive into cases I've come across and believe is worth covering. Make sure you're interacting with us across all our social media platforms. And as always, thank you for being a part of the MIB fam. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black. See you next week. Thank you.